Just move on up for peace of your mind into the steeple of beautiful people where there's only one kind. So hush now, child.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast, Abstract Failure. My name is Sean Walsh, sort of freelance writer and scribbler, and I do this podcast with my co-host, James Bembridge, who is deputy editor of Country Squire. Hi, James.
Hello, Sean.
And we have an extremely interesting and exciting guest today. We have Simon Evans, stand-up comedian, writer, polymath, TV presenter, raconteur. Hi, Simon. Do you want to say anything about yourself before we kick off? Or?
Yes. Google my name for tour details for the autumn and spring. And
I was going to mention that. It's what's it called? It's Do I Know You or Have We Met? Is that right?
Have We Met? That's right. And but in Edinburgh, I'm doing a couple of shows about Adam Smith and David Hume. So those are a little bit of a change of direction. But and then the old tour continues in the autumn.
It's the right place to do that, Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
I think we were chatting on the phone last week, Simon, and I wrote an article for Daniel Johnson's publication called The Article on, I think it was called something like The Ethics of Reading Books, because it had occurred to me a couple of weeks ago that people sometimes get this wrong and that they think that reading is not so much an activity or as a kind of form of passivity, and it struck me that was the wrong way to look at it. So I thought we could kick off by talking about that and just see where we go from there. So any thoughts on that, Simon?
On the active reading idea?
Yeah, the whole idea. I mean, I was looking at a book it came out about 1940, by a guy called Mortimer Adler, called How to Read a Book. And he was dealing specifically with non-fiction books. But what he does in that book is introduce a set of heuristics whereby how to get the best out of a book you're reading, essentially. And, sort of statement of the obvious, really. But it struck me that people sometimes get reading wrong, especially reading books wrong. And that when you read a book, you are a participant in something as much as a spectator of what's on the page. And that when you're a participant of something, obviously there's a normativity involved. There's sets of etiquette and manners and demands placed upon you as the reader. So that was the thought. And then I looked at the idea of whether or not you could be friends with a book, whether books can be part of a friendship or not. And I sort of concluded they couldn't be. But the possibility that they might be said something about the nature of human persons over time. How, for example, can you interact with something by Homer, several thousand years later? So that was kind of the thoughts I had behind the article, but I'd like to hear what you think.
Well, I'm aware of that book and of Mortimer Adler's. He was one of the figures behind the sort of Great Books project, wasn't he? And the idea that Americans should all have a substantial liberal arts education. They should be familiar with the great philosophers and proper literature.
Yeah.
Which was the sort of thing Americans used to aspire to. And there's a good deal of nostalgia when one reflects on that kind of culture and how it used to be. Even Reader's Digest, as tiresome and dead weight it always appeared on dentist coffee tables and so on, at least spoke to an aspiration in America that people would be acquainted with that kind of thing. But I haven't read the book itself. I read one by Harold Bloom that was in a similar theme.
Yeah.
How to read. But yes, it's an interesting idea. The idea, as you say, that there's an etiquette, that there's an onus of responsibility on you as a reader. I suppose the obvious rebuttal to that is that once you're alone with a book, there is nowhere and there is no mechanism by which you're going to be observed whether or not you're living up to your responsibility. And human beings being what they are, if there isn't a cardboard cutout of a policeman standing in the corner of the room making sure that you're behaving yourself, you will not do so. I mean, some people might do. Their conscience might be enough to make them take the book seriously. But I suspect that most of us, like the vast majority, treat books quite disrespectfully, read them in quick snatches on the bus or on the loo or in the bath and put them down and abandon them a half or even a tenth of the way through or skim parts that they don't find very interesting. There are some horrific statistics that have emerged since the introduction of the Kindle about just how many books don't ever get finished. And I think we're all aware now that if the internet and such like technology has exposed an awful lot of dishonesty on the part of people generally. Things that they lie about, how much pornography they consume, and so on. But that's one of the sort of probably gentler truths that we're confronting.
How many people do you think have lied about reading Ulysses?
Reading the James Joyce book,
Yeah,
Ulysses. Yeah, funnily enough, that's in my show. Have we met? Ulysses, and not reading it. Yeah, it's it ties in with a series of events that took place on June the 16th, which is Bloomsday. The action all takes place on June the 16th, and having a sort of unearned frisson of enjoying that day, even though I haven't made any impact on the book. But I mean, God, it's incredible. Yeah. Heavyweight books like Ulysses, Proust, A Man Without Qualities, some of those big early 20th century modernist novels in particular, I think it's kind of fine to actually know roughly what the proposition is and what the thought is and to have conversations. I wrote a piece for The Critic a couple of years ago discussing, not having read books, the different ways in which you can not read books. You can buy a book and then just not read it, or you can never buy it but read reviews about it. You can read proper reviews in the London Review of Books or the Literary Review or the Spectator. But actually, I think you can get a great deal, I think, from reading reviews on Amazon, in particular, if you read the longer reviews, obviously, and also especially the 3 and maybe 4-star reviews. 5-star reviews are almost always too excitable, and 1 and 2-star reviews are almost always have some sort of issue.
How do you know the reviewer hasn't? How do you know the reviewer hasn't done the same thing?
Yeah, it's possible. Yes, it's true.
There are 2 removed from the original text. It's like a Verdos number.
They do put verified purchaser on some of them, but. But I mean, books do enter the conversation without, and people are expected to have opinions about them without having read them a lot of the time. And I mean, I have developed, as I think a lot of people do, as you get a bit older and feel you have a little bit of spare cash and a kind of nagging doubt that you frittered away your earlier decades. I've developed a terrible habit now of buying more books than I can possibly read, but I don't feel it's entirely immoral or delusional, because I do kind of feel that they have a slight sort of energy. They vibrate very slightly on a certain frequency on my shelf, and they are reminders of the things that I was thinking when I ordered them, and the article that I read that they were referenced in, that I thought, that would be a good little an outpost on that central land that I have occupied.
Have you ever bought a book, Simon, to put on your bookshelf, just to impress friends at a dinner party?
Well, certainly not a dinner party. I mean, I haven't. God, I know it's a sort of a catch-all term for general sort of middle class socializing, but we just don't have dinner parties anymore. And certainly don't have them in rooms with bookshelves in. I've got about 3 friends that I've allowed into my study. It's I would say the short answer is no. Not that the Spine would impress anybody, but there are books that I have bought because I felt that I wanted to have some understanding of the contents, so that the next time I have a conversation with a certain specific person, I will be able to say to them, "Have you read this?" Or you mentioned that book to me, and I have bought it now. And then I very rarely, really complete the deal. And actually, but I have some kind of sense of having, paid them that compliment, that courtesy.
It occurred to me
actually. For instance, I can specifically say there are 1 or 2 friends I know who know quite a lot about foreign affairs, or possibly about the war, and I always feel slightly, humbled in their company, and I think, damn it, next time I will go into that conversation better read. It doesn't work.
It occurred to me during lockdown, actually, that with people having these ostentatious backgrounds of their alleged reading material, that it'd be funny just to do a podcast with just a Kindle behind you, decorously arranged. Sorry, James, you go on.
You wrote an article for Spectator Life a few years ago, I think, in which you were in defense of audiobooks or something. Because people sneer at those who consume the book via audio and might think that disrespectful. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Audible is an absolute lifesaver, stroke game changer for me. I probably get through 10 times as many books in totality on Audible than I do a hard copy. In fact, I hardly ever finish a book from beginning to end as a book now. Most of the books that I buy as sort of reference books, even if they're not quite written as reference works. I want them on my shelf so that I can reach up and find out what, look something up in the index. Audible is how I complete at least 90% of the fiction that I read now, and probably most of the nonfiction as well. Things like philosophy or history, I find much easier to consume. Partly because you can fill in time when you're not otherwise, entirely constructively engaging your brain, like driving and so on, or walking the dog, but also actually because even if I do set aside an hour to read, I find the actual business of reading soporific now, and I don't know if that's age. I think, if I'm honest with myself, that's almost always been the case. One of the reasons I did complete my law degree, but I knew well before the end that I wasn't cut out to be a lawyer, was because reading legal textbooks just put me to sleep. Literally, I would fall asleep in the library. I'd be found with my head down on the desk, and I don't know whether that is a sort of eye strain, given that there is definitely something tiring, and I think it's worth recognizing that and not being harsh on yourself. There is something tiring about processing information. The brain is a calorifically hungry organ, and it is comparable, to a slow jog at the least, if not a sprint. Actually reading anything. Of course, there are novels that don't, drain your thoughts very much. But anything where you're encountering a new piece of information or a new proposition or argument every paragraph, that will get tiring and you will feel sleepy. But I am, it seems, able to, absorb an hour or two as an audio book without falling asleep, whereas quite often 10 minutes with an actual book and I'm just, I start to swim. So that has absolutely saved my life, or at least my capacity to keep up with things, But obviously podcasts are even more enlivening and keep you awake even more. There's something about the rhythm of speech when people are trying to think on their feet. It's one of the reasons I've said before that I found Jordan Peterson so fascinating and involving and compelling, even though I could realize that some of the things he was saying were pretty out there and challengeable, certainly. But the sense you had of a man struggling, in real time to express himself adequately and as fully as he could was compelling in itself. And that is, I think, why podcasts have really taken off in a way. But the truth is, you don't, generally speaking, get quite the full structured argument that you will in a book, or indeed, the amount of information. There are exceptions. No, but it is interesting, I think. Go on.
It's not as well structured, no, but it doesn't mean that it's not a complementary intimation of truth. I think with Peterson, what's very interesting is how emotional he gets when he's actually in the thought and in the moment.
Also, it's not just that he's thinking on his feet, it's that you see in real time a man who is capable, and often does, of changing his mind and his position on some arguments,
Yeah, absolutely. I was struck when he said early on in his speaking career, I think, that he had made a commitment to himself. I think he said it was a sort of dark night of the soul moment. Made a commitment to himself that he would constantly monitor himself to make sure that he was saying what he genuinely thought, that he was not just repeating easy, shibboleths or boilerplate prose that he'd read, and checking himself. And you can see him doing that. It is compelling. I have noticed something that I think is quite interesting. I've never seen anyone else identify this, or I expect it's occurred to people. That if you tune in, if you get in your car and you turn on Radio 4, for instance, which is the easiest place where you'll encounter both forms, you might be about to encounter like a play or a book for today or something where people are reading from a script, or you might be about to encounter people who are speaking freely, unprompted in an interview or something. And it's interesting to me that you can tell immediately, like in under a second, you can tell whether the person speaking is reading a script or indeed speaking words that they've rehearsed and memorized, or whether they are asking or answering a question or in genuine dialogue.
Well,
there are one or two people who are quite good at memorizing a monologue and delivering it as if they are just thinking of it, but they're very, very rare. And if you listen to something like Will Self doing Thought for the Day or whatever, not Thought for the Day, but you know, the one he does, there's a sort of 15-minute monologue where they get to explore a topical subject through their own reading and specialisms or whatever. Occasionally, you know, one of those, he can speak for 5 or 6 seconds before I realize it's a but that's about the limit of it, which is incredible, really, isn't it? When you think these are professionals whose whole, you know, if you're an actor doing a radio play, the one thing you ought to be able to do is make it sound natural, but it's pretty much impossible.
There is one person who is excellent at thinking on their feet, and if you actually transcribe what they say, they rarely give interviews, but when they do give interviews, it's interesting. And if you transcribe the interview, it does read like prose. And funnily enough, that's Bob Dylan. You look at a Bob Dylan interview and you know, certainly compare it with his poetry and his lyrics. It's very, very different. It's very clipped. It's very analytical. It's very straight. And it's obviously very in the moment at the same time, which is kind of what you're referring to. It's a very rare gift.
Yeah.
Well,
I can believe that. He's a very thoughtful guy, obviously, and he is also very much aware of performance and mask and so on. He always has been, and character. A bit like Springsteen in that regard, you know. I think a lot of people thought of Dylan as an earnest and sincere and authentic voice for a long time, but that's not quite right. He's really a kind of constructor of little characters and masks and costumes.
Yeah. Who's the author who wrote that?
As a person who did something you wouldn't have believed them capable of, and you go, oh well, okay, well, I'm wrong. You know, that's interesting. I feel like personally I can cope with quite a few of those sort of things, and I don't feel it's unpleasant. In fact, I do welcome them, you know.
Yeah.
Then there are other times when you read somebody's, you know, you try and read some Judith Butler or something, you know, and that she would probably think that she was an axe to the frozen sea of your complacent heteronormative patriarchal assumptions about society, but,
I'm having
as a reader, you just experience it as gobbledygook. You know, that's different.
Yeah, I think the conundrum's easily dissolved. You just make a distinction between something being enjoyable and something being pleasant. I mean, or exciting, like you say.
Yeah.
It can be exciting but unpleasant and not enjoyable at the time. I mean, I'm going through something similar with Richard Dawkins, actually, who I for a long time have disparaged as a brilliant scientist, but an absolutely shit philosopher, and certainly a shit theologian. And he seems to be mellowing, and I'm finding it disconcerting that he's mellowing. And he's actually saying, I don't know if you saw him on Twitter the other day when he was saying, could anyone tell me where exactly I went wrong in the God Delusion? And I was about to say, well, I can do no better than refer you to Ed Feser's book on the New Atheists. And as I was about to press post, Ed Feser popped up and said, I can recommend my book. So Twitter's weird. But what you say about being wrong, James needs to come in a second, I think, because we missed him. Being wrong can be enjoyable and also extremely disarming. There's nothing more delicious than on Twitter saying to someone, yes, you're right, I'm wrong, in the middle of a real bus stop, because they don't quite know how to take it.
No, they'll say, what do you mean I'm wrong? I'm not done with you yet. That's a perfect way to explain it. Simon, do you know the podcaster called Andrew Gold?
Yes, I do, yeah.
So I've just been reading his book to review recently. I'm reviewing it next week. Read it about 1.5 times. But as we were saying earlier, I'm also at the moment studying for these tests for this job that I'm hopefully going to get. And because it's, time's limited, bandwidth is limited, I read half of it, then listened to the other half on Audible. So I've still got the physical thing to refer back to should I need to. But very, very interesting book. So it's called The Psychology of Secrets. And it's basically all these kind of batshit crazy kind of stories that Louis Theroux would do documentaries on, stuff like that. So weaving all these stories together to try to explain, why people hold secrets, why they share them, what it does to a person, the burden of it. And in the one part of it, Andrew said that at any one moment, most of us have about 13 or 15 secrets that we're not sharing. I was thinking, well, why don't I? And then I realised it's because in order to hold secrets, in fact, in order to share them, a big motivating factor is shame. We're ashamed of what people might think of us, but then we sometimes tell them anyway to lift the burden of shame. Now, why do I not have secrets? Well, it's because I have such little shame, I think. What about you two? Do you have any secrets, or?
Simon, over to you.
Well, interesting. I'm back again. Where did I get to?
No, you were just. I think I heard something about adultery and some sort of stripper or something. So you've already shared your secrets, Simon. Might as well just end there.
I didn't hear the.
I was saying. I was saying that there are at least two different kinds of secret. If, as I say, if I had an adulterous affair, then it would be a dangerous secret that I had to be careful with myself not to share with friends, thinking they would find it amusing. I might be tempted one night after a couple of beers to kind of go, you'll never guess what I did, because it would be great, would form a little confidence with them, but there would then be a higher risk of it coming out. And I would always be afraid that the person with whom I'd had the affair might, go through the same thing or whatever, and it would get out and it would ruin my life. So that would be one kind of secret. But there are vastly more secrets that are not, nuggets of fact that you have to bury in a lead-lined bin 20 miles under the surface of the earth. There are secrets that, perhaps your political persuasions are a little bit further to the right than you tell your friends. There's the sort of shy Tory kind of secret, or there is the secret fear you have that you're beginning to lose your memory, or that your sexual performance is deteriorating. Those are secrets, but they're more. And I think there are probably like almost limitless numbers of those if you really drill down into it. The fear that perhaps that the secret that actually you did cook your kids some chicken that was technically out of date, and then one of them, had the runs the next day, and it's like 3 years later and you still remember, oh God, that was probably me, wasn't it? It just depends what you call a secret. Do you know what I mean? There's, it's a very nebulous, and I'm sure Andrew explores that. He's a very intelligent guy, and he will have realized that. But so you can sort of, you can bend the stats a little bit to say we're all walking around fizzing with concealed secrets and lies. I mean, I was, as you probably know, subject to a secret of that kind. My parents didn't tell me, ever, until I confronted them about the true origins of my existence. So that was a fairly big one that they'd been living with, and in a way, I feel more badly for them that they didn't feel able to tell me than I do for me. But it was a significant sort of part of our lives. But I don't know whether it was typical, that one. Yeah.
I mean, in my case, I'm speaking as a recovering alcoholic. When I was an active alcoholic, I felt shame all the time, James, all the time, because your whole life is a form of dishonesty. And occasionally the dishonesty is not necessary. You just then fall into patterns of behavior because they are patterns of behavior. So I think there's a difference between feeling shame and feeling guilty about keeping a secret. I think shame is a little bit more existential than that. I think it's what Bernard Williams called a thick ethical concept. It's not just that there's something wrong. There's an evaluative component to it as well. But I think because I go to group, I go to fellowship meetings. I'm going to one tonight. That in AA, it's very interesting because there's a rush to spill secrets. So it's only in an AA meeting. I realise we're digressing here, but that's podcast, isn't it? It's only in an AA meeting that someone can tell a story about how they got drunk, run someone over, killed them, ended up in a police cell, and someone else will say that was a lovely share. It's very weird, inverted moral universe. So there's kind of, the more secrets you tell, the more cleansing it is. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, James. It's what.
But to go back to when we were talking about how we can always tell when someone's reading from a script, even when they're trying to show spontaneity or something. Well, an example I was going to give of that was this writer called, what's he called? Michael Wolff. Do you know Michael Wolff?
I don't.
Right. So anyway, he used to be, well, he wrote an article on Christopher Hitchens after he died.
We were mentioning Christopher when you were off air.
Oh, okay.
Just so you know.
So what I was going to say is that he wrote an article after he died, very mean-spirited, ill-spirited one of him. And he was saying that whenever he went to the shows that he did for his tour for God Is Not Great, where he had to debate with pastors and priests or what have you, he said that much of what he said in these debates, which, again, had the illusion of spontaneity, actually, much of his words came from ones that he'd already written in his articles, according to him. But then I was thinking,
I can vouch for that. It's true.
Right. Okay. Well, I can imagine it's true, but what's wrong with that? It's like if a woman has a nice dress, why only wear it once? Why only use the line once?
Because the dress was pretty shabby in the first place. In the case of Christopher Hitchens, what I referred to as village atheism, it was a shabbily thought out assassination attempt on a God that no serious theologian thinks existed in the first place. That's why I wouldn't have rehearsed it if I were him. It's quite ironic, isn't it, that Christopher Hitchens received a nasty obituary from someone, given what he said about Mother Teresa.
He said about
we should park that one.
My feeling with Hitchens' speeches and prose, I mean, as a stand-up comedian, one of the major talents you need to develop is the ability to make it sound as if, not that everything is spontaneous, because that wouldn't be realistic. You have to do your material and then throw in little asides and toppers, which do sound as if you've just thought of them, or as if you've made yourself angry now and you're going to go in a bit more on this than you had planned to, that kind of thing, And so I am inclined to agree with you, James, that nobody should be held to account for repeating material that was prepared if you can make it compelling. I suppose there is always that slight kind of, there are different contexts, there are different environments where there are different expectations, but stand-up comedians definitely try to give the impression that everything they're saying is just coming straight off the top of their head and it's always a lie, Eddie Izzard was brilliant at it. And that, funnily enough, I suppose is the sort of sweet spot between the two forms of Radio 4 speech.
Yeah.
I think there is an acceptable degree of reworking in the Hitchens kind of environment. I will say, I mean, I'm a bigger fan of his than it sounds as if Sean is. Regardless of the atheism stuff. Even then, even in his writing, if you read enough of it, if you read enough of his essays, collected essays, you notice there are certain things that come up again and again, certain quotes, certain passages that he likes to quote from, whether it's Churchill or Martin Amis, and I think most authors are like that, certainly if they're knocking out a couple of thousand words a day, which by all accounts he was regularly so.
No, I think Christopher Hitchens was a genius, don't get me wrong, and I loved his writing, and I remember he was on television being interviewed by Andrew Neil years ago. I think I was still an undergraduate, so we're talking about the mid-'80s, and it was a discussion on the monarchy. And of course, Hitchens took the Republican view, as does Andrew Neil, I think, but Andrew Neil was playing devil's advocate for the purposes of this discussion. And Andrew Neil at one point says something like, Christopher, would you mind repeating that point? Because I didn't quite understand it. And quick as a flash, Hitchens said, I'm not in the least bit surprised. And then just moved on. He reduced Andrew Neil to speechlessness. No, but I didn't mean to come across as churlish about Hitchens. He did a lot of stuff that I thought was fantastic. But the new atheism thing does stick in my craw a bit, as is obviously becoming obvious. Have we got 5 more minutes left?
Yes. I was just going to.
Yeah, by all means.
I was just going to say, I really don't want to end on the discussion of this person, but can we talk about Rory Stewart?
Yes, of course.
Well, what has he been saying today? That the Conservative government will only get back into power if they move to the centre. Move to the centre? Well, they'd have to move from the left. And
very much my thought when I saw that. Yeah, I did wonder whether to post to that effect, but it's pointless now, isn't it? Yeah. It's extraordinary the degree to which, like, Labour vote. I mean, Stewart is just a ridiculous, it's self-deluded that the idea that he was ever a Tory in any regard whatsoever.
Well, there wasn't. It was with the Lib Dems.
I think I think the divide, though, the disconnect between people who think that the Tories have been an appalling 14 years of austerity and, just like jobs for their mates, corruption, couple of million here, couple of million there on PPE that never came through, and ignore all of the huge betrayals to the people who actually voted for them, of the mass immigration, the escalation of taxes, the complete failure to roll back any of the Blairite quangocracy and so on. All of those aspects of their betrayal of trust. That is clearly what's lost them the vote. That's why there's been a mass migration, and the idea that they've swung to the hard right and that this is what has alienated voters is just absolute tissue of lies. I just don't know. I don't know how anyone can believe that. But the thing with Rory Stewart is I don't watch his podcast very much. The only thing, funny enough, I did watch it this morning because I was amused to see what he and Campbell would make of the Biden, Farrago debate. And it was quite funny watching them both going, well, this is a catastrophe. Like lots of left-wing commentators who had apparently been completely in denial about the state that Biden has been in for at least 2 years, at absolute minimum 2 years. Biden has been very evidently suffering from, at the very least, mild cognitive impairment, possibly actual Parkinson's. Who knows what kind of cocktail of drugs they put him on for various special occasions, and who knows why they didn't kick in during debate night. But, it is, again, a mass delusion. There are so many mass delusions now. I don't know that there is actual dishonesty. I do think it is conceivable that some of these people have persuaded themselves that, they're in the right, or possibly just that they mustn't rock the boat. Another one would be David Aronovich, with whom I had several quite bruising encounters, because I used to regard him, I knew we were politically some part, degrees apart, but I felt we could have quite sort of collegiate, convivial conversations, and I was quite flattered, I suppose, that a man with a column in the Times ever took the time to speak to me. But he became ridiculously inflexible on the view that, Biden's age was of no relevance and that this was just a right-wing talking point because they couldn't be bothered to engage with the detail. I was like, listen, I don't care really, to be honest, if the Democrat Party has a sort of second tier of administration that handles everything and you're happy with the program. But don't piss on my face and tell me it's raining. Biden is defunct. He is completely defunct. And if you want an intelligent, quick-witted operator to at least, provide a reassuring figurehead for your political program, then he ain't it. And you can change him now. But I don't know whether they can. This was a year ago,
Yeah.
So I feel like vindicated and furious at the same time on that stuff. It's been, because it's just been, and it's almost impossible to point, it's so exactly the Emperor's New Clothes. It's so on the nose. It's the exact plot, and yet anyone saying so was essentially regarded as being pro-Trump, which, I think Trump was also victim of a huge number of hoaxes, misrepresentations, exaggerations, and so on. But I still don't regard him as the best the American people should be presented with as an alternative to Biden. There must be better on both sides. It's just absurd where they've got themselves now.
I'll just ask you one more thing before we end, Simon. What do you think about the phenomenon of so many Generation Z men turning more to the right?
Well, yeah, like under 25 or whatever.
Yeah, from 16 to 25.
Well, possibly because they've noticed. I mean, I doubt they feel like about the right wing political program. I don't know that it's very much to do with a kind of Thatcherite, I'll sort myself out, just leave some tax in my pocket kind of thing. I think they, fundamentally they feel abandoned by the state generally, and they see the way that house prices are being used as the last possible, piece of wreckage that anyone can cling to and so on, and that they've been cut out of that. So they need some sort of change. But I suspect that it is partly probably mass immigration, and partly even young men probably recognize, even though they haven't been around for very long, that their country is changing very fast and not in a good way. But also, I suspect, the red pill stuff, I think,
That's
probably in terms of LGBT and feminism and, that kind of all that sort of social, that kind of social policy is they're just going, are you having a laugh? Again, the idea that you can constantly demonize a demographic and they won't ever turn against you.
I know. Constantly, but they've been told they can't behave as lads, that they're the banter, which is natural between men their age, is very dangerous or toxic. So they're I think that's the reason why they're going to someone like Farage, because, all the people who are telling them these kind of like mirthless, po-faced middle-class female teachers. Yeah. Farage annoys them so much. Basically they're just, they're revolting against. It's not just even in the classroom. Can they escape? Their escapism would be video games or films. Well, now much of the action heroes, which would have used to be men, are kind of half-caste lesbian women. In the video games, this has been proven to happen in the video game industry. You'll have a very aesthetic design for a female character, and then the higher ups say, "Oh no, we've got to make her look more natural," which means to uglify her. And so everywhere young men turn, everything's against them.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And also, I think they feel it as a state of health. They just feel sort of depressed. They feel boxed in, and at an age when they should be just out there roaring through the streets, within legal reason, but, occasionally transgressing. They cannot do anything now without it being told that it's toxic. And I don't blame them at all. When I see my son who's 17 and his mates, one of them, just last weekend shinned up a rugby post in the park and then fell off and broke his wrist, and was lucky to get away without a spinal injury. And there's a part of me goes, oh, Christ, don't do that to yourself. But also I was a tiny bit reassured to see they're still capable of that kind of nonsense.
I know exactly what you mean.
So anyway,
I know what you mean.
Yeah. Well, it is encouraging, and perhaps, even more encouraging what's happening in France and across Europe at the moment. It'll be very, very interesting to see. But there's a lot of support. I think, political machinations may yet thwart them, but there's a lot of support for what amounts to a kind of reform agenda in France. Marine Le Pen's party is considerably less sort of properly hard right than it used to be, and but it was still has obviously sort of put the frighteners on the centre and left in France. But they again have I can't remember his name. There's a young fellow, isn't there, who's the actual leader of them at the party level, who's only about 24 or something. I mean, Farage is great as far as he goes, but he is an old man, and this is probably his last hurrah, I suspect. He's got to be looking to recruit, but it is more encouraging that, I think there are young people who will support that. And of course, it is all about, obviously, critical mass, because if you feel like you're going to be isolated and you feel like you're going to be mocked and excluded and ostracized, then you won't stick your neck out. But as soon as you get enough people gathering, others will go, do you know what, you're right, I agree with you, And,
that's an optimistic note that perhaps we can end on. The note.
I was just going to say, Simon, have you noticed that Keir Starmer seems less enthusiastic about lowering the voting age to 16 now?
Well, that's encouraging.
Just move on up. For peace you can find into this people.